wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight. We have a very exciting program, very exciting and timely program tonight. We're going to be talking about the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And the last several months have been sort of a remarkable time in Venezuelan history. You have seen massive protests in the country. You've seen an effort to push aside the current government and to reestablish democratic governance in the country. You have seen a massive humanitarian crisis emerge. The pictures from the New York Times this weekend were truly harrowing and tragic. It was incredibly hard for me to look at the New York Times and see the child starving to death unnecessarily and having untreated muscular paralysis. In addition to that, the United States government and its allies in the region have pursued efforts to remove the Maduro government that has ruled Venezuela for a number of years now, and this has led to confrontations on the Venezuelan-Colombian border that led to immense challenges there, led to trucks being burnt and efforts to bring humanitarian aid into the country. Following that, there was a multi-day blackout in Caracas that beyond all the challenges associated with blackouts that most of us think about, surprisingly enough, you find out when you read about a national scale multi-day blackout that water doesn't work, right? People lacked potable water in their homes. It was a truly remarkable and harrowing stories. We had earlier this month or at the end of last month an abortive military uprising, the escape of one of the leaders of the democratic opposition from house arrest and into, I believe, the Chilean embassy, the Spanish embassy. Yes, initially the Chilean embassy and then the Spanish embassy. It is an incredibly complex humanitarian issue facing the country, a catastrophe of historic proportions, which, as the New York Times noted in their article this weekend, is the most significant economic collapse any country has experienced in decades that is not occurring in the context of war, civil conflict, right? So this is a sort of secular collapse of the economy associated with a series of challenges that have occurred in the years since the Bolivarian Revolution at the end of the 20th century. We have here tonight to discuss the challenges facing Venezuela and the region, two experts on the country. The first is Verónica Zubiaga. She is an associate professor at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas. She is a visiting fellow right now at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame University, and she's preparing a book entitled The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela with David Smildy and Rebecca Hansen. Her research focuses on youth gangs, armed violence in Caracas, gender, and public policy. Her previous publications include co-authored books entitled Violencia Armada y Acuerdos de Convivencia en una Comunidad and La Sociedad de la Incertidumbre. Our second speaker is Alejandro Velasco, an associate professor at New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Studies. He is a historian of modern Latin American democratization, who published with the University of California Press, Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela, which couples archival and ethnographic research to examine how residents of Venezuela's largest public housing community pursued citizenship during the heyday of Latin America's once model democracy. So I wanted first to start with Verónica and ask her, can you describe the challenges that are facing Venezuela today? What's happening in Venezuela and how this is affecting the life of ordinary Venezuelans?
Yes, well, thank you. I would like to start saying thank you to Desmond and to Baruch College for inviting us to be here and to share the experience we are living in Venezuela. Well, I will start saying that the crisis has started very evidently in 2014. In 2013, Maduro was elected president. Before, in 2012, Chavez won the presidency, and then compared to his opponent, Enrique Capriles Radonsky, he clearly won with a 12% of votes favorable to Chavez. But 6 months after, Nicolás Maduro was elected, and the gap very importantly was reduced. So from the beginning, Maduro was experiencing a very low, support to his government compared to Chavez. The difference between Maduro and, again, Enrique Capriles Radonsky was 1.6%. So only in 6 months, there was a big difference. From 2014, we have started to experience a decline in oil prices that have affected, in very important ways, Venezuelan economy, but not only in the decline of oil prices, but oil production in a country that depends absolutely on imports from the oil production. So the crisis has been very evident since 2014. We had 1 month of protests that year where 43 people were killed in the streets. Then in 2015, the National Assembly was won by the opposition. Then we started to have a very important struggle in the scene of the state. Again, in 2016, there was the opposition tried to have a referendum that was absolutely canceled. So in 2017, the Supreme Court tried to cancel the National Assembly, and that produced that the General Attorney said that the constitutional thread was broken. That meant that we were living a sort of a coup d'etat. That produced 4 months of protests where 124 people were killed. According to Venezuelan NGOs, but also to the General Attorney, 40% of these people were killed by the police forces and 22 were killed by these armed civilians called colectivos. And then just today, 1 year ago, Maduro was again elected president in an election that has been considered widely illegitimately, not only by Venezuelans, but by most of the countries in Latin America. So right now, we know that at least in 2018, 64% of Venezuelan people have lost 24 pounds. 3,500,000 people have left the country, and projections are to 5 million. So we are experiencing, not like we were discussing this morning, this is not a crisis anymore. This is like a collapse of a country. I will stop here to leave.
So, Alejandro, do you think you could contextualize this historic moment in the post-Pérez Jiménez period?
Right. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Also, I apologize for my attire. I came from NYU, just down the street, and it's hot, as you know. So I'm still kind of a little bit sweaty. Well, first of all, Pérez Jiménez was the last military dictatorship in Venezuela, who ruled between 1948 and 1958. And the reason why that's significant is because when he was overthrown on January 23rd, 1958, and that date will become significant in a moment, this ushered in a period of significant democratic stability, alternability of power by multi-party or multi-class political parties that were in a region that was otherwise known for civil wars and military dictatorships, seemed to be kind of a standing out, right? It seemed to be kind of an island of democracy, partly sustained by the wealth of oil, which had been nationalized in 1976 and brought about a tremendous windfall of revenues for the country that were nevertheless not very evenly distributed across the population, leading therefore to what scholars and others have called the paradox of plenty, where Venezuela, even though it has tremendous amounts of natural resource wealth, it nevertheless also experiences dramatic inequalities that often manifest themselves in sizable amounts of poverty, especially when oil prices begin to collapse. So this is partly what we saw already in the 1970s and 1980s, a huge period of oil boom that then was followed by a period of oil busts in the 1980s that then generated this tremendous impasse in the context of higher and higher inequality that then ruptured in 1989 in what was known as the Caracazo, a series of urban protests that were severely repressed by the state, the democratic state at the time, the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez, in what the Inter-American Court of Human Rights subsequently called a state-sponsored massacre, where officially upwards of 300 people were killed by the military, but then later mass graves were found that pushed that number up towards 2,000 and perhaps a little bit higher. All that is to say that this ruptured the sense that Venezuela was an island of stability and democracy and of competitive electoral systems. And in particular, this really came to a head on February 4th of 1992 when then Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez staged a failed uprising to try to overthrow the government of the president had presided over this massacre that I just mentioned before. Even though he was, the coup was a failure, and he ended up in jail afterwards, that really sort of broke the back of the idea that Venezuela could withstand these multiple crises that were affecting it. And throughout the 1990s, what you had was deepening poverty, deepening inequality, a banking crisis that wiped out the savings of many in the middle class. You had an initial, although by no means as significant as we're seeing today, people leaving Venezuela, repatriating their money elsewhere, especially upper classes of the country. And then eventually, in 1998, Hugo Chavez runs for president after he's pardoned for having participated in this coup, and he's elected, right? All of that is to say, in terms of contextualizing in the longer durée, to some extent, the story of Venezuela that we're seeing now and the crisis, even though it is extremely dramatic, it must also be understood as a part of a broader cycle of booms and busts that have afflicted governments of very different stripes in Venezuela, military dictatorships, democratic multi-party systems, as well as socialism of the 21st century, which is what Hugo Chavez called his movement. What we're seeing today, as you mentioned in the Times piece this weekend certainly makes a case for it, is far more severe and dramatic than any of those previous boom and bust cycles. But what's most distressing, as somebody who is from Venezuela, who has family in Venezuela, I was just in Venezuela in January, and we can talk a little bit about what the conditions that I saw while I was there, is that the central crux of the problem, which is this tremendous dependency on a natural resource that is so fluctuating, is not even up for discussion, right? So if you poll anybody, whether opposition or government, the answer always comes back to oil. Oil is either going to save us or it's the reason for our misery. And there's a real sort of lack of imagination that otherwise seems to perpetuate the notion that regardless of what happens, who is in power, the only thing that really matters is what the oil prices are doing, right? And so, this I think is part of this larger sort of story of boom, busts, collapse, and apex that has this really significant expression right now, but is in fact part of a much longer story.
So, Venezuela has been sort of mired in a crisis and now into catastrophe in recent years. But Veronica, I mean, I want you to think back on the late 1990s when Hugo Chavez eventually comes to power in Venezuela, and for a number of years was actually quite popular. What was it about Chavez in those early years, especially, that brought him to national prominence and that made him such a powerful and compelling president for much of the population?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will say two things. One that is associated to what Alejandro just said, that we had a process of deepening inequality, and then Chavez, with his discourse of social justice and reivindication of the people, and again, what is very evident in his discourse is the agency he was willing to give to the people. So for the first years during the Bolivarian Revolution, we were living a very optimist wave. We were discussing to have a new constitution, and people participated, and people in the popular sectors felt they were becoming subjects of a political process. And I will say that is very important, specifically compared to the old elites in power that treated the poor people as being the poor people, or just assist in a very assistential way. There was certainly a change in the political discourse, and that combined with the oil boom, of course, that began to be very evident in 2004. After especially the coup d'etat, where we lived a coup d'etat in 2003 and then an oil strike in 2004. So, and the opposition was really discredited. It was a very harsh moment in Venezuela. So Chavez again became more popular. And with the oil wealthness we had at that moment, of course, Venezuela financed many other countries in the region, and we started to have, I will say, interesting economical exchanges with other countries. What happened also is that from 2004, we had a referendum, and then I will say that we started to have, at least until 2012, a certain pacification, in the sense that it was evident that a new political elite was guiding the country. Chavez never suspected he was going to die of a cancer. I mean, he always thought he was going to die in a revolution or in a very heroic way, but he finally got a cancer. And then he died officially he died in 2013. Other hypotheses say that he died on December 2012. But these undoubtedly political charisma, he had this dramatical talent. He was almost like a theatrical actor. He could be speaking for hours in his program, A lo Presidente, and he changed subjects from poetry to history too. So he did have an important charisma, I will say. Combined with oil wealth, he had this incredible power. But Chavez died in 2013, and oil prices declined very evidently.
Well, and this is a good inflection point, I guess, to ask you about, how did Maduro coming to power amid oil price declines, the decline in oil price, affect Venezuela?
Of course.
Talk a little bit about the emerging crisis under Maduro, both on the economic side and on the political side.
Yes. Well, Maduro is a very different story, in the sense that he became president in a very different context where oil prices had declined in a very important way. He did not at all he doesn't have at all the same charisma as Chavez. He is, right now, the levels of popularity of Maduro are on 13%. Right now, we live what I will call rituals of despise. That means that people systematically, in the frame of this crisis, systematically insult Maduro. There is a very popular ritual right now where somebody, for instance, imagine a city where everything is black. So the buildings in middle classes neighborhoods, everything is black. So somebody will shout from the window, Maduro, and then all, people in chorus will reply, coño de tu madre. That means fuck yourself. So I will say, and from the anthropological point of view, I analyze this like a ritual, a collective ritual of despise.
This is in a blackout, like when the lights
Well,
are
but
off.
this has become like a sort of a ritual that you can find everywhere. For instance, it became very viral in a YouTube video where there was in a peak hour in the train, and then somebody in a very popular sector, somebody shout Maduro, and then the rest replied in that way. So it has become like a strategy of resistance among the what people are living. But I will say that compared to Chavez, there has been a strong militarization of society. In 1999, when Chavez came to power, 10% of the ministries were military. In 2017, there were 50% of the ministries were militaries. And the militaries now are responsible of food distribution. They are responsible of the oil mining. That is also, there is a lot of violence in the south part of the country because there is also organized crime. Militaries have been denounced of corruption in all very different but massive different fields. For instance, in the border with Colombia, those who are pointed out as responsible for oil illegal traffic are the militaries. So I will say that Maduro, being conscious that he has not the same legitimacy as Chavez, he put many militaries in many important positions. So it is a country that also, I will say that in the 80s, Caracas was, it was a sort of a metropolis. You could have museums, and then you have the beautiful metro. And today, there are militaries everywhere. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, also PDVSA, that is the state oil-run industry. The president of PDVSA right now is a military that comes from the National Guard with no experience in the oil industry. Mm-hmm. So this has been, a terrible wave of militarization, of mismanagement of every single economic sector of the country, and people are experiencing a harsh moment. So survival strategies form part of everyday urgency of people. For instance, buying something as simple as a bottle of milk. If you're in a middle-class neighborhood, you have to go at least to 5 different stores just to get one milk, and you are not sure that you will get one bottle of milk. So then you have to start to call friends in order to ask if they have milk, and then that you can bring oil the day after if you find. So every simple activity of the everyday has become a complex activity.
So this is a good segue. I wanted to come back to you, Alejandro, and I wanted to ask you, about your experience in Venezuela in January and what you saw and how your family.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So I was telling Veronica that I planned my dates very wrong. Mm-hmm. Because I arrived on January 10th, which was the day that Maduro was to be sworn into office for the second 6-year term that he had won after these elections that were highly contested last May. And there had already been, for months prior, sort of warnings and sort of open threats that the opposition was not going to recognize Maduro. And the question was going to be, well, if they don't recognize Maduro as president in this new term, then what's that going to leave us? And so I thought that things would kind of go down on January 10th, and nothing happened. It was actually quite quiet. There was a small protest that happened the following day that Juan Guaidó, who had become the president of the National Assembly just a couple of weeks prior, had staged. And in fact, there was all sorts of confusion as to whether he had said that he was now going to be the president or not. There was a conflicting press releases that were issued both by his office and the National Assembly office saying that he had and that he hadn't. And so for a while, actually, it seemed like it was basically status quo, where you had an opposition that, even though it was very ascendant in terms of its popularity going back to 2015 and in winning the National Assembly, had been doing well what it had always been doing well, which was to fight among itself, to be completely incoherent, have very little strategy in terms of going forward. And so that seemed to be like what was going on. Meanwhile, in terms of the everyday, what was striking to me is that, to your point about these strategies of coping with crisis, one never wants to say that it becomes routine, but there is a way in which dealing with crisis is routinized, right? And so that, me coming to Venezuela every 6 months or a year, I see dramatic differences. But when I talk to my friends and family who are there, they're like, well, this is kind of how we've been doing it for now 5 months or 6 months. So they're kind of getting used to that dynamic, right? So, and yet at the same time, the major thing that was going on in January was hyperinflation, which is something that perhaps you can think about, right? So inflation in Venezuela is projected to be upwards of 1,000,000%.
Well, it is now 1,000,000%, and it's projected to 10,000,000%.
Well, the numbers are fuzzy.
Yes, but
on that.
I mean,
the issue is that when you get to that kind of number, right? Like, it doesn't matter. It could might as well be 1 billion. Right, between 1 million and 10 million. The issue there is, what's driving that, number one, and what effect does it have? And the effect that it has, of course, is that you arrive at a store, even if you find the product, right, it might be completely out of your hands. Yeah. So what ends up happening, whether you have 1 million or 10 million or 1 billion% inflation, is that the economy becomes virtually dollarized. And so what we had beginning a little bit before, but certainly by January, was the de facto dollarization of the economy, which of course creates other kinds of problems in terms of who has access to dollars. Right? So if you have family that has left, has migrated, some of these 3.5 million people that you mentioned, then you might have access to some remittances. And that grants you a certain kind of ability to be able to weather the crisis. But if you have no access to dollars, then you really become extremely dependent on the aid that not the aid, but the food, the subsidized food that the government provides in very irregular ways, which of course then deepens a kind of affiliation with the government, right? And so it creates a kind of perverse, dynamic in terms of political loyalties, et cetera. So that's one of the things that you saw, and yet at the same time, again, it was very strange that you could still go out to a mall, right? And there were still things functioned. You could go watch a movie if you had enough money to do so. You could find products if you were able to afford them, right? So there was this strange kind of paradox where, and the work that I do is with popular sectors, so going back to the barrios, and there of course the crisis is more pronounced, and yet at the same time there's a sense of making it work somehow, right? Which is one of these things that you don't always sort of think about in these moments of crisis.
Well, I've been to Venezuela a couple times, and this is one of the things that I noticed that was really dramatic, right? You go into a poor community, and people are talking about buying a quarter kilo of ground beef, right? And just making ends meet in the most basic ways, or not having access to basic medicines. But if you're in a nice neighborhood and you go out to a restaurant, they've got Johnny Walker Blue Label on the menu, and it might look in some places like you're on Miami Beach, right? Yeah. And there's this really dramatic contrast between how some people are living who are engaged with the international economy and have access to dollars, right? And how the vast majority of Venezuelans are living, right? And producing sort of dramatic pictures and harrowing stories, and millions of migrants into Colombia, people just picking up and leaving and going to Colombia to live in conflict zones in Colombia just to not be in Venezuela. Which is something I've seen in recent months in Putumayo, Colombia, and Urabá, Colombia, where the Venezuelans have been arriving into parts of Colombia that themselves are in horrible crises, right, and then exacerbating the crisis in those areas. I think this is a good moment to go back to Veronica, and I wanted to ask you, Veronica, if you could talk a little bit about the factions within the Bolivarian regime itself, right? What are the different competing elements of the Bolivarian regime, and how is that affecting the stability of the government?
Well, for instance, right now you have a hard core of Maduristas that are united. And many Chavistas ministers have split from the government. Mm-hmm. And then what you are having right now is a very different opposition who is very heterogeneous among it. And that has a true difficulty to coordinate action, like Alejandro was saying. But Chavismo then right now is very divided as well. So you have the hardcore Madurismo, but also you have new groups that are called, for instance, the Sons of Chavez, that says that Maduro has treasoned all the Chavismo legacy. Also, you have another group that is called the Platform for Defense of the Constitution, that reivindicate themselves as also Chavistas, but are in rupture with the Maduro government. So and also you have many ministers that have split from Maduro. So I will say that Maduro has achieved to stay in power because he has done a very important connection with the military sector. So that is one of the strongest signs of the government in this moment, that it has become a militarized government.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk perhaps, following up on this, can you talk perhaps a little bit about the experience of crime and corruption in Venezuela today and how that's connected to the operations of the government?
Yes. Well, what is very evident concerning to crime is that Venezuela in 1999, when Chavez came to power, had the same homicide rates compared to, let's say, Ecuador or Brazil. In 2016, Venezuela's homicide rates are compared to El Salvador. That is one of the countries that has the highest homicide rates in the world. So I will highlight that, especially when Maduro began his presidency in 2013. But in 2015, we started a very important process of militarization of citizen security. So there has been a development of militarized interventions in the poor sectors that are producing blood bath. So already with Chavez, the militarization of citizen security started in 2010. That produced a very important increase in the population in prison. That, a little bit like in El Salvador, produced a reorganization of the criminal world. So you had, for instance, in the barrio where I am working, where one of these military interventions started, before 2015, you had like gangs that were confronting among each other. Departing from these military interventions, what produced is a reorganization of the gangs that became organized criminal groups in communication with gangs in prison. So we started to experience a more organized criminal world. And also, the military interventions have produced massive killings in these neighborhoods, but in the country in general. For instance, in 2016, the general attorney denounced that 4,000 people at least were killed by the police forces. So, and every year, departing from 2015, we are experiencing at least 4,000 killings by the police forces only. This means that the police in Venezuela are killing more people than in Brazil, for instance, that has 200 million inhabitants. In Venezuela, we are having right now 28 million, but police forces in Venezuela are killing massively. Yes,
Yeah, and so I mean that I wanted to sort of push you on this a little bit more, and I wanted you to talk about the involvement of certain factions within the regime in the drug trade and in the exploitation of mineral resources, and the role of colectivos in controlling the basaqueo.
Yes. So
And if you could explain what
very
basaqueo means.
yes. Also, what is very evident is that the regions in Venezuela where we have experienced the highest increase of homicides are the regions that are linked to illegal economies, of course, but where you have different factions fighting and struggling among each other. For instance, in the borderline with Colombia, that we have a very important activity of illicit oil traffic, but also food right now. So the militaries are invested with oil traffic, but food traffic. Also in the northern part of the country, in the limit with the Caribbean Sea, there in El Estado Sucre, there is also a very important increase in homicide rates that is linked to drug trafficking. And then in the southeast part of the country, you have also a very important increase in homicide rates that are linked to illegal gold mining. And in all of these points, the militaries are engaged and work together with organized criminal groups. And you are speaking about the colectivos. Alejandro has done research also about the colectivos. The colectivos, of course, you have to add colectivos is a general name to name popular sectors, organized groups that can be working for culture or popular organization. That is different from armed colectivos, that are the armed civilians that defend the revolution. So the origin of the colectivos, Alejandro has done research of that, is very evident since the 1960s. But they were after all the guerrilla we had in those years, but they were concentrated in a neighborhood that is called 23 de Enero. So there is a long tradition of ex-guerrilla groups that became pacified, but still some of them were armed, and they were concentrated specifically in some neighborhoods where they worked as a sort of a vigilantista groups? Vigilantes group. So what has happened right now is that there has been a mutation of these original groups, and then you have a sort of new opportunistic colectivos that are in the very gray zone of criminality and willing to defend with arms the revolution. You have also, I will say, other colectivos that have links with the government that receive money from the government, and they are also willing to defend the revolution, but they have more formal links with the PSUV, that is the Socialist Partido Socialista Unido. I mean the Chavist official party. And then what we are living right now in Caracas, for instance, where we were doing research, is that the colectivos are working systematically in some areas that the police do not come, but they have developed webs of extortion rackets to the population. So they are, again, in this gray zone of extortion, criminality, and it's a sort of militia that is able and willing to defend the revolution.
Alejandro, do you want to add anything about the colectivos and sort of your analysis of them?
Well, I've always thought of it as kind of interesting because when I was doing most of my field work in 2004, 2005, 2006, the term colectivo didn't exist. But the thing that we now call colectivos existed, right? So it kind of became this, this term that began to be used around 2007, 2008, to, exactly as you say, to designate a wide field of armed non-state actors that nevertheless, because they were so widely represented, also missed significant nuances that are now, I think, coming a bit to a head, right? So the only things that I would add is, the way that in the research that I do, come to distinguish between colectivos is there's basically three types. There's the one that had its roots going back to the 1970s and 1980s in these sort of demobilized guerrillas, which then use some of their tactical know-how, but also some of their ideological projects to be able to forge links among the sectors where they worked, especially popular sectors that were being hit hardest by this growing inequality that I mentioned before. And they were also therefore really suffused with a kind of sense of a very kind of radical leftist politics. And so this is why these colectivos, they were both very organized, had strong tactical know-how, and had an ideology that sometimes was even more to the left of Chavez when he was elected. And so even though they saw in Chavez somebody who provided a sense of aperture to be able to do kind of experiments, political local experiments that they hadn't been able to do before, they nevertheless also held him a little bit of arm's length. And there were also, there's documented cases when Chavez would explicitly call out these colectivos and say, he, coming from the military, would see them as kind of, pardon the use of the term, usurpers of the monopoly of violence of the state. And he would say, you have to lay down your weapons because the military is the only one that's responsible for having weapons and having the violence of the state. Maduro has completely shifted that, right? Maduro has openly called for colectivos to take up, exactly as you say, the defense of the revolution. Interestingly, in ways that are actually very strategic, right? So you mentioned before what happened in Colombia, and one of the more remarkable things that happened in the border conflict in February 23rd with the humanitarian trucks trying to come in was that it wasn't actually the military which was stationed at the border, which is, of course, the primary function of any military is to defend the borders of the state. And yet it wasn't the military. It was the National Guard and mostly colectivos. And I think the reason why is because Maduro understands that as much as he requires the support of the army in particular to be able to stay in power, the army also has limits to what it's going to do in terms of an open repression of the state. So it's not usually the army that's doing the kind of repression that you talk about, it's the National Guard or these colectivos. Because they, of course, are completely, they have tremendous impunity. Right, versus the army, which would have a more command structure, and so therefore, in kind of international human rights systems, that they would be far more liable for these kinds of actions. And so, the colectivos that emerged before Chavez and that Chavez had held them at arm's length have become much different in terms of basically the tip of the spear in Maduro's repressive repertoire. And then you have these other kind of mutative groups that they do maintain some sort of links to the state, and yet also some sort of roots in sort of local community organizing. But it's become this kind of catch-all term that I think obscures the fact that there's a tremendous amount of nuance within them.
So the last several months, there have been a tremendous amount of protests and activities. And I wanted to ask Alejandro to reflect a little bit on the current wave of protests, the current wave of pro-democracy mobilization or regime change mobilization in the country, and how that fits in the history of popular mobilizations in Venezuela.
Yeah, actually, maybe I slightly disagree with the framing. One of the interesting things that we've seen since January 23rd, and sort of this is to close out the story when I was there in January. So like I said, I arrived in January expecting things to kind of go down on that day, and nothing happened. And then because nothing was really happening, I left on January 22nd. And going back to January 23rd, 1958, which was that date that the last military dictatorship was overthrown, it's a very important symbolic date in Venezuela, sort of connotes this return of democracy. And so on January 23rd of this year, Juan Guaidó, the president of the National Assembly, in a very significant rally said, that's when people were expecting him to have done what people thought he would do a couple weeks before, was to say, we invoke an article in the Constitution that says that because the executive power is vacant, since we no longer recognize the legitimacy of Nicolás Maduro as president, the power of the executive now vests onto the National Assembly president, i.e. him. Right, and so this, as you perhaps have been reading, ushered in this tremendous kind of, tug of war in terms of who actually controls the state legitimately. And even though Guaidó is supported internationally by the United States, most countries in Latin America, and 50 countries worldwide, and Maduro supported by Russia and China and Turkey and other kinds of nations, the fact is that the opposition does not control command of the state, right? They don't have command of the state in terms of the statecraft. And so, there's a significant legitimacy battle, but really what matters is who controls the state. And what's significant about that is that, yes, there was that major protest on January 23rd, but in fact, protests in Venezuela have tended to decline significantly. The number of people being out in the streets protesting in Venezuela itself has actually been quite low compared to 2017, compared to 2014. And the reason for that primarily is that the center of gravity of the opposition and of opposition politics in Venezuela, beginning in 2017, shifted from the domestic sphere to the international sphere. And this was for reasons that are very, you can sort of think about and make sense. Primarily it was because most of the people that had mobilized for 4 months and had died in these protests in 2017, once the National Constituent Assembly was installed, which is the primary sort of node of struggle there was a sense of, well, what are we going to do now? The government then, the Maduro government, reacted tremendously by exiling many of the opposition leaders, especially of this one party, Voluntad Popular, which is where Juan Guaidó comes from, who had been at the forefront of some of these protests. And others, they were banned from running for office, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was a sense that and then there was an attempt to create some sort of political dialogue in 2018, which went nowhere, and was really seen in 2017, which was really seen by international actors, especially the exiled community, as an attempt by the government to stall, and so therefore to gain time and to remain in power, right? Mm-hmm. And so the domestic opposition was losing significant amounts of power vis-a-vis the international opposition, which was now becoming much more ascendant in terms of its access to international nodes of power, in particular the United States, right? And so this is basically, and I wrote an op-ed about this in the Times back in February, where the shift that happened after January 23rd was that Venezuela became basically a geopolitical struggle, a proxy struggle, a proxy war between major players in which the domestic scene is less significant than how international actors position themselves vis-a-vis what is happening in terms of the future of this country, right? So it's been a bit of a paradox, right? That the kind of protests that you've seen Guaidó call for instance, have diminished significantly in terms of scale, but that's not making the situation anymore, reach a resolution. Quite the opposite, right? It's actually, if you think about it in the international context, that's where most things are happening.
I will add that 2017 we had 4 months of protests, and we had 124 people that were killed by the police forces and by the colectivos. But what happened in 2018 is that protests were less evidently political, but we had 12,000 protests that year, but they were associated to the lack of services. So people have been protesting a lot. It's only that after 2017, people were so frustrated and the opposition was so discredited that the protests had less this political turn. But 2018, people protested like, well, imagine 12,000 protests a year. That means like 34 protests every day. So there is a lot of struggle and turmoil among the population. When Guaidó declared himself president this year on January 23rd, there was a huge manifestation that day. I mean, there was the images were so massive. What has changed, I will say, after April 30, that there was this military essay of Guaidó and Leopoldo López, is that civilians have been discouraged to participate in protests because they realized that there could be important violence. So people supported Guaidó at the beginning very evidently. Also, we have to point out that Guaidó forms part of the generation of students that became protesting in 2007. So he takes part of a new generation of politicians. So that's why he has been such a new figure that for the first months gave sort of hope to the population. What happened on April 3rd, the April 3rd, 13th, is a very challenging moment for Guaidó because people got scared
So
of
April
the
30th
military.
was the effort to create a military rising against the Maduro government, announced from a military airfield close to the area where most of the protests take place in Venezuela.
I mean, discouraged people to go because there was a call for a massive protest on May the 1st, but seeing all that happened the day before and the militaries being the protagonist, civilians were discouraged to participate in the protest on May 1st, and then on the next Saturday that there was again a call for protests.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So now we have an opportunity for some question and answer from the audience.
My name is Mario Pasantes. I wonder, because you read a lot about Cuban interference in Venezuela, about 200 Russian troops here and there. What's going on? Is there a real role for them, or who are they backing?
So the relations between Cuba and Venezuela have been long-standing and go back to around 2003 and 2004. Even before that, if you think about the personal relationship that Hugo Chavez had with Fidel Castro, it began in the context of implementing social programs, especially after the oil boom, first having to do with medical missions, which were in Venezuela called Barrio Adentro, but Cuba sending doctors abroad is a long-standing part of its foreign policy efforts going back to the 1960s. What's happened, certainly under Maduro, is that those kinds of relations, which primarily had to do with health and other kinds of social missions, have increasingly turned more and more to the repressive state apparatus, right? And so you have more and more documented cases of, Cuban intelligence officers being part of the Venezuelan, being part of the Venezuelan state, not being part of it, but advising. So that link is very much there, and I think in part it has to do with Cuba, of course, feeling very much that it has come to depend on Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Cuba continues to receive, despite the oil embargo that the United States announced earlier this year, something upwards of 50,000 barrels of oil a day from Venezuela, which it then not only uses domestically, but that sometimes also sells in the international market, which have become increasingly more and more significant in the context of renewed sanctions on Cuba by the United States government, right? And so there's this strange kind of triangulation where, sanctions on the Venezuelan government have pushed Venezuela closer to Cuba, which in turn pushes Cuba closer to Venezuela and kind of strengthens that relationship. In terms of Russia, yes, there are Russian military advisors. One of the ways to read this is, there's many ways to read this, but I'll just say two. One is that under Chavez, what you had was the transition of Venezuela's military park, military armory, from what had previously been the case, which is very closely aligned to the United States. So most weapons, advanced weapon systems, were purchased from the United States, to, in the context of animosity between Venezuela and the United States vis-a-vis in the Chavez era, moving more and more towards Russian weapon systems. But one thing is to fly an F-16 jet, another is to fly a Sukhoi 30 jet, especially if you're from Venezuela, you don't speak Russian, right? And so one of the interesting things that are gone unmentioned, largely unmentioned, is that many of these advanced weapon systems that Venezuela bought, especially helicopters, have crashed, and that's primarily having to do with lack of operational capacity. So anticipating a potential conflict with the United States in the context of heightened tensions over the last few months, Russia sent advisors basically to say, you need to learn how to actually operate these vehicles if you're actually going to be able to use them against an invasion. So that's one way to read it, right? That it's more about that shift in the nature of the weapon systems that then require more advanced training. Another way to see it, of course, is that Russia is seeing this very much as part of a much larger geopolitical battle, right? So, Venezuela is not Syria for Russia, insofar as it can't easily allocate the kind of personnel and equipment and materiel that it was able to allocate in Syria to prop up Assad. But what it can do is have kind of these symbolic gestures of we are backing the Maduro government, and then put the squeeze geopolitically in other parts of the globe, namely Ukraine, right? And so one of the things that you saw a couple of weeks ago when Trump met with Putin, and they talked about Venezuela, was that there was an agreement basically that Ukraine was going to now be Putin's territory, and that was going to be okay. Right, and so I think there's a way in which these presences of Russian personnel in Venezuela are primarily sort of a symbol to say we're staking our ground there, but it's primarily because we don't want to be completely cast out of the region, and if you sort of force your hand in Venezuela, then we're going to be able to turn the screws elsewhere in the globe. This is a classic and tragic proxy war.
My question is more about what led to this situation, and if you have to go back a few decades, what are some of the root causes? And you mentioned, I think I heard you say something about rising poverty, but are there more stories that you could tell and go back as far as you have to?
I think that to imagine and to understand what is happening today, I think it really needs to be understood as this sort of dramatic pendulum swings that characterize a petrostate like Venezuela, which is different from Saudi Arabia, which is different from Norway. It's a petrostate that is founded on the notion that once we have an oil revenue windfall, not only are we going to be wealthy now, but we're going to be wealthy forever. So we not only spend what we have now, but we're going to be spending even what we anticipate having. And this creates this tremendous gap between what you can actually bring in and what you eventually are able to spend. But the other thing that it creates is tremendous expectation, right? And expectations of limitless wealth, which then collapse very spectacularly. And then what that leads to is not only a collapse of the economy, but a collapse in the idea that whatever state is in power can be redeemed. Right? And so this is why you have traumatic transitions that basically break history in half. This is why you have, the Fourth Republic is what starts after 1958, and this is why you have the Fifth Republic, starts after 1999 when Hugo Chavez is elected, right? Because it's really, literally, right, seen as the start of a new country. And every time you start a new country, create these new expectations, which are buoyed when you have high oil prices, but then are completely collapsed when you have low oil prices. The final thing that I would say on that point is, the other thing, of course, you might be thinking about starting anew, but you never start anew. You start with the institutions that were left before, and you also start with the structures of power that were left before. And so one of the things that happened in those early years of the Chavez era that Veronica was alluding to, yes, there was a tremendous degree of sort of popular effervescence and political experimentation, but there was also tremendous pushback on the part of sectors of the prior elite that were seeing themselves very much threatened, even though some of the policies that Chavez were announcing were extremely tepid at the time, very, very tepid. Chavez didn't talk about socialism until 2005, even though, of course, we think about him as a socialist firebrand. But the word socialism, he didn't even utter it until 2005. So the reforms that were being pushed between 1999 and 2004 were actually quite tepid. And yet the response on the part of the opposition at the time was extremely anti-democratic, tremendously insurrectionary, a coup in 2002, the oil industry's lockout in 2002, 2003, then the recall referendum in 2004, which Chavez won, but they didn't believe that he could win, that somebody like Chavez could win, and so they said it must have been fraud. And that led to the most disastrous, catastrophic decision that the opposition has made, which was to boycott the National Assembly elections in 2005. Right? And what that meant basically is that after the coup, Chavez had control of the military. After the oil industry lockout, he gained control of the oil industry. After the boycott of the National Assembly, he had control of the legislature. And these were all largely, pushed and pulled by both Chavez and the opposition, right? So, and that discredited the opposition in those early years, and it had to do so much work between 2005 and 2015, 10 years, to really come back into the scene as a viable democratic option, right? So none of what yes, there are these longer causal factors, but certainly in terms of what's happening today, I think it has to be understood as, Venezuelans sort of, everyday Venezuelans who are struggling as much as they are with the crisis, not necessarily feeling like either of these two sides, not that there's any needism or anything like that. Certainly there's much more support for the opposition, but you would imagine that there would be zero support for Maduro. And the fact that there's even 13% suggests that something deeper grained is there that can't just be attributed to, to the military.
So thank you.